Yeah, I grew up in inner city, St Kilda, still barracked for them, unfortunately. But I was just studying, but I always had this idea, sort of nagging to join the Australian Defence Force. And to be honest, it wasn't sort of a popular thing back in '89 when I joined. Not many people actually wanted to go to the Defence Force, but that's all I sort of wanted to do since I was a little kid. In particular, my grandfather, he was Navy. I don't hold that against him, me being Army. But, I sort of looked up to him, and I think I did sort of listen to the stories, of the Anzacs and everything like that, it just sort of stuck with me. The other choice I wanted was a fireman. However, to be very outside of all that, I was actually studying art. And I was just born with the ability to paint, draw and all that sort of things, and won a few awards, and everyone sort of wanted me to follow that desire and go through that. But I certainly realised studying that it was like no one actually is famous or rich until they're actually passed away or they've done something crazy like cut their ear off. Well, this probably shows how far we've come in the way that we get information. There's no such thing as social media, and really anything that was recorded basically had to take it was on a VHS or a beta tape, and was sent, by standard sort of mail before you got anything. So, to be honest, Rwanda was, no one actually really knew what it was, even the first contingent that went. Because even though I was in the second contingent, the first contingent come from 2RA as well, and most of those people had gone through initial training and all that together, and the School of Infantry, and we all trained together. But we were sort of privy to the information that they had, but it wasn't that much. So even our initial training sort of centred around the veterans that had come from Somalia. So we were doing sort of training that was almost like through the streets of Mogadishu and things like that. I definitely remember the whole trip because it was quite an eye-opener. I mean, I had been overseas before. In fact, my company had been together for a long time, which was quite good. It didn't sort of move apart like things sort of happen now. We'd been places like New Zealand and all that. But when we deployed over there, it was like we'd never been anywhere before because it was just such an eye-opener. They had a plane called... from a company called Tower Air, and I think that company got banned from actually landing in Australia because the safety standards were so below par. When we got into the aircraft, there was like internal parts would actually fall off and all that, because basically to get us over to Africa, which is on the far side of the planet, they went and booked the cheapest sort of flight they could. And looking at it now, we didn't have the Air Force that we do today, which has its own capability to get us there. But when we got over there, I just remember one of my good friends that I'd gone through training with, and to relate to some of the movies when they talk about the 1,000-yard stare, these people I could see were just like fatigued, mentally fatigued more than anything. And they just appeared like a shell of what they were. And they had this sort of dark sense of humour about them. I mean, some of the things were quite funny that they did. Like they certainly greeted us in stories that you hear about Australian troops all the way through history, Like there'd be... they had a whole collection of books. And then we didn't realise till months later what they had done, which was they ripped out the last pages out of every single book. So as you read through them for the few months, you go, oh, and it'd have something like, Love from Alpha Company at the back of it, and they go, oh, so every book was like that, They had taken the time to go through hundreds of books and rip all the last pages out. Or, and they had big giant signs and that saying, welcome to Rwanda, and had the amount of days there, and smoked those Embassy Blues, which are like these cigarettes that were local and quite harsh. And I'm guessing, all cigarettes obviously we know today are quite bad for you, but I think these ones are even worse. But they had big signs like that, and yeah. So the way where the mess hall was, the kitchen was inside of the building, but you basically served like it had a window that sort of opened to outside. So you had to grab your plates, go to where this window was, and you're standing outside, and they would serve it up. There's a bain-marie there and everything like that, and then you would walk down the road a little bit, go up some stairs, and you'll be in the mess hall. And it was just because the way it was organised to get everyone fed, because the building wasn't actually made to be a mess. So on our initial meal, I just remember all the Alpha Company guys watching us get food, and we're standing there, and my first meal, as I was walking along with this outside going to the stairs, I felt like I got hit by this wet mop. Oh, what was that? What it was these big giant birds like ravens, hawks and all that. They would just sit up there, and they would just they were aggressive and just grab the food off your plate and just take off. They just stood there watching us and just sort of laughing like, hey, sort of baptism of fire, so to speak. But there is a bit of a macabre story why some of these birds were there. Because there have been so many people massacred and killed, there was just this overabundance or the population of these large birds had grown because they were eating all the dead bodies and that. So every now and then on patrol, you would have some body part just drop out of the sky or something like that because they've been carrying it and just like, you'd never imagine something like that in your wildest dreams. But the food, actually, so the caterers, every operation I've been on, to be honest, caterers have been number one, so they know, it's a good morale thing, to keep the food up. But I'm pretty sure they got a commendation or something like that, but everyone was quite friendly with the cook. So, and always Australia, in its support, always seems to put so much money towards the way that we eat. Yeah. Looking at the place, Rwanda, there was no typical day, but you went on a rotation, and I'm pretty sure it was like 4 different rotations. So the first being, one would sort of be like your rest rotation, or there was a main base, which used to be the Kigali Rwandan Officers Academy, their equivalency of Downtime, but obviously quite small and not as grand, so to speak, and that had been all sort of bombed out, and you had to provide security to that place because there's still a threat inside the city of Kigali, the main city of Rwanda. The next one was what we were really over there for, which was hospital duty, and that hospital duty was to guard the hospital, which was about 400 metres up. So you had front gate security and everything like that there. And the next one was providing like patrols out to outer areas. So we'd be in vehicles and we'd go out to camps where displaced people would be, and that would be one rotation. And then I think the last one was actual rest, and you stayed at the main camp. So there's sort of a reserve, so to speak. So you had those 4 main tasks. But daily, we just do that. Security was our thing. A lot of us would just, go to the makeshift gym that they had. That seems to be a normal thing with a lot of the pass the time, because you don't have all the bells and whistles of things today where, you can just get on there and you've got, thousands of movies on your hard drive or anything like that. So we didn't have that. We actually had to get tapes in or get mail in or something like that, or do things like just sit around and talk with people, play a board game or something like that. But a lot of the time you'd be working, so But I remember we watched quite a few movies or so. The other thing was we actually went out on patrol and we spoke with the kids that were around the area quite a bit. So that's probably one of the hardest questions you asked me because I can't really remember that much downtime. I haven't really contemplated it that much. We didn't have any real interaction with the intra-army, which were the main offenders, the first ones who had been pushed into the camps and over the border at all. But our main thing was interaction was the children, a lot of them orphans. One personality, a lady called Madame Carr, who's actually quite famous if you go back to things like the movie Gorillas in the Mist. She actually is one of the close friends of Diane Fossey. The lady who did that, and she used to go stay with her. So we go out to her. She ran her own orphanage. Non-government organisations, so we had a lot of dealings with them, you know, like Doctors Without Borders and, a myriad of other sort of organisations. But and AusAid, I think they may have changed their name now, and a few others that were there. Other armies, so we, the British, the Canadians, because it was a Canadian-led mission. They were quite prominent and around, so they were quite close to us. And of course, some of the victims or patients that you would have coming in when you're at the hospital, you'd be like stretcher bearer for them and all that sort of things, because there was still a lot of acts of violence, mines, a lot of people would get blown up with mines, etc. So you'd hear a blast, and then you go, oh, yep, I'm going to go down to the emergency area, and a family, you bring them there and you have to bring them in. So that was our, our interaction with all the other sort of groups. Yeah. So we didn't do any mine clearing, but I just remember I was playing soccer with some of the kids, and the kids actually just, like, I was running, you know, like, get this ball, and I just noticed no one else was around me, and all the kids were like, because I didn't speak Kini Rwandan, the kids, you just sort of, they actually started to learn Australian. In fact, probably the worst Australian. They were learning Australian Army English. You know, it's got a few profanities in it. But they stopped, and they were just basically saying to me, like, boom, that I was standing in a minefield. So, and I just remember, oh, I'll walk back the way I came, and they just kept, you know, cracking on with it. You know, they said there'd been mines in that area. The other one that we had encountered was some British engineers. They were clearing down near a bridge, and they cleared it all. They got rid of some mines, and they went down, and the next day, and one of them got blown up. Someone had put a mine there, and they were watching them, and they basically, you know, deliberately blew up one of the UK soldiers. You know, he was missing his legs and all that sort of thing. So he had several cards. I can't think back. I think it was a light blue card, just like the United Nations one. And then I may have some of my different deployments mixed up, but I definitely know there was a light blue card. And I thought another one was pink for this, because then other operations later had orange, silver, and et cetera, et cetera. But this one, the colours I just remember were very more pastels than anything else, and I think it was a pink and a light blue colour. But and I'll make a point later about how far we've come from this point. Our equipment was quite below par. You know, Australia had sort of bled itself away from post-Vietnam, and, you know, just like a lot of the equipment was starting to become antiquated, and it was just a trickle of stuff. So what we went over there with to compare with later what we have now is, so different. So what we learnt was we shouldn't go under some of the rules that we have, like with the UN, where they basically said you can only defend yourself. We had like 2 magazines of ammunition, because some people sort of ask the question, how come you didn't protect all the people that were getting murdered? And that it was like 10,000 RPA, and it was 3 sections of us. So sometimes it's better to be in that peripheral as the observer than be one of the people that get encountered, because we had also checked our own history. 28 Belgian paratroopers have been murdered right in front of the Canadian UN person, Romeo Dallaire, months beforehand. So we knew what these people were capable of and the bloodlust that they get, and sometimes it's like, hey, we just need to be like a porcupine, protect each other, and if we can, protect some of the people that we can, because you can't save everyone, And those rules had really sort of hamstrung us, and just our equipment and just the way it was. And I think holistically, in the big picture, if you look at what happened with Somalia, in particular the Black Hawk Down incident, America didn't want to get involved in anything like Rwanda and that, and not many people had a real flavour to sort of do anything. They probably thought this was going to be just a sort of like Cambodia that sort of happened, or Sinai and all these other sort of UN missions. However, this one went horribly wrong for the world, so to speak. We just happened to be in the middle of it. Kibeho, so my role again was provide security to a medical team. So we had a medical team go down there, and it was all on the intelligence information that the RPA may have some vengeful acts for the Interahamwe who had committed all this genocide. And they were going down there, and they were saying that there were training camps for the Interahamwe to rise up again. And historically, Rwanda's had one demographic being the Tutsis and the Hutu. They'll rise up and they'll train over the border, and they'll come over and fight them, and then so on and so on. And it's just been like that for centuries, so to speak. But this time, obviously with the war, they'd killed like 2 million people in around 2 weeks or so. So they'd really had, gone full on. I digress from your question, but from that intel and looking at and needing to understand the history of things, it seemed like it was going to be another tit for tat type of thing. So they went down there. We were close to the area because we were doing sort of other outer patrols because we were vehicle mounted, and then we basically got called up to go support them because a massacre had started there, basically vengeance acts against the people. So when we initially got there, the Australians had started a triage station, and they were also with the Zambians who actually had an outpost there. All the people were fleeing from the shooting that occurred. A lot of them had been killed, so they moved, tried to get into where the UN soldiers were to protect them. A lot of them obviously didn't make it, and the RPA were not. It was like they had the blinkers on for any UN troops. They're just they're there, but they're basically like observers. They can't do anything. That's just our country. That's get our vengeance, so to speak. So we're there. We provided security. We looked after the triage station. And this went on for quite a few days. I personally got re-rolled into walking around with the United Nations Provost Marshal for that. So he was a military police officer, and he was basically investigating what sort of The first thing was he was walking around with the old pace counter, and he was checking how many bodies he could sort of see. After a count, because they'd have these long toilets and they were just dumping bodies in there or into the river, you had to start saying, I think there's 100 in there, there's another 100 there. That it got to around 13,000 or so, you're saying. I think when you look at the official records, it's way less than it was. But I could just know from my own sort of, what I witnessed, there was, a lot. You just look out and across the terrain and you see, littered with bodies from mothers with their children strapped to them and all that sort of thing. They'd both be murdered or die of, starvation because their parents have been killed. There was, at the hospital, just infection and disease was always there. That the dead heart of Africa, it just was rife. So AIDS, we're talking, the 90s when it was the biggest threat to the world because people didn't know what it was. You'd actually go into the AIDS ward and you'd see, like 3 people in the one bed. They're that sort of skinny and they're basically on palliative care. We were doing one of the outer patrols, and I just remember you'd get these updates or reports over the radio, and the message was there's a suspect case of Ebola at a village just over the border. I reckon after hearing that, in about 2 seconds, I was seeing the fastest U-turn in history. A vehicle like, hey, we're not going up near there, let's just get out of here. Even cholera in the camps, that was, basically a waterborne disease, which once you get it, people are gone from that. I got 2 bouts of malaria over there, but in saying that, I didn't know I had malaria at all until I went to East Timor and got dengue fever. When they did a blood test, I said, hey, you've actually got these 2 bits of malaria. I think there's 5 in the world. I've got like 3 of them, but to be honest, it hasn't affected me yet, knock on wood. But dengue fever certainly does. Yeah. One thing, we had a lot of vaccinations, which is, I'd say Australia does, all throughout its history. It had learnt quite, from the lessons learnt being jungle fighters and that, like in Vietnam, Malaysia, and World War II, that you need to have, preventative medicine against these sort of combat these elements. Being on a trip that was predominantly doctors and everything like that, they were very, quite aware of it themselves. In fact, we had to take doxycycline, I think, for 6-7 months, like that, which people complain about because sometimes people wouldn't eat and have it, and it gives people, they say it gives people weird dreams and all that sort of thing. I don't know if that's a urban, or I'll say, rephrase that, an army myth. They just, we had to take quite a few quinine as well, all that sort of stuff. There was another interesting thing with water. There's a big lake there you couldn't go into. It looked great. Apart from the hippos or that and some of the other areas that would kill you at night time if you went into them, because of the wildlife there as well, especially big gorillas. But the in the lake they had this, like some bug or something like that, so if you got into it and it got into your system, you basically would die. A lot of places were just not nice. Australia's a harsh place, but Africa can be just as harsh. There was this baboon. Baboons are quite aggressive, and it would hang around the hospital. And they thought it had rabies, and they tried to relocate it, and they put Valium in an orange, and they gave it to it, And this thing would go to attack people, and it had actually bitten people, and the precaution was you had to get I think it's around 7 injections, painful injections you got to get for rabies, to prevent, I think, because once you get it, that's it as well. So there's a combination of the disease and the nasty animal. But baboons are like a really aggressive animal, and you'd be walking through the hospital and this thing would be in the middle of the hallway all of a sudden and want to attack you. And I think what triggered it, one day someone saw it and went to throw a biscuit at it, like they trying to be nice to it, and it hit it in the head, and it just actually kicked off and started, racing around and everything like that. So someone defended themselves and they hit it with a cricket bat. Every good Australian carries a cricket bat somewhere, and all it did was stun it and make it angry, because this thing's basically 10 times stronger than a human. Racing around, and people went and hid, and and nothing happened. And when it ate this orange too, it actually enraged it and made it get angrier. It didn't even affect it. It did the opposite. But then one day, it come out on these people sitting on guard duty in like a gun pit, and they were looking out, and it came over the top of this roof and it just tried to start attacking him under there. The cricket bat come out again, and they hit it, and then they put it in a bag, and I thought, oh, I've killed it. And they went and got someone and said, they brought them over to get this thing, to get it relocated or just get it hidden, because they were worried, oh, well, we've killed this animal. And then they looked in the bag, and it was just sitting there enraged again. And it kicked off again. So they kept hitting it with a cricket bat, and it wouldn't go away. Eventually, they disposed of it. Yeah, that's probably the nice way of putting it. But that was just one, wild animal. I remember I went up to see the mountain gorillas. If you're in a place like that, quite rare to see these animals, and you don't realise how big they are. And I was certainly interested when you first get into country, they had a stuffed one in the lobby. We'd also heard that they not just had murdered people, they were going up and just killing the gorillas just for the sake of it, You get up there and they tell you not to stare at them, because like monkeys, if you look at their eyes, they get challenged. Just to look down and be obedient, and never run, they say. Okay, all right, cool. And walking up there, and there's like the guides with us, and there's a few other like doctors and nurses, and I was the lead person. I must have had alpha male syndrome. I'll lead from the front. But the reality was, I was like, that was the scariest thing I can do, because you could see these things. They're like the silverbacks, like one finger's about the size of 4 of mine, and it's just snapping bamboo and just chewing on it. And as I'm walking closer, it started beating his chest, and I'm like, oh, here we go, it's going to kick off. And then it runs to challenge at me, and I just look down and I'm like this, and I'm sure I could. I was, shaking as well, but I remember just standing there and then looking, and it took off. It did a few grunts of like, oh, yeah, you're nothing. I've stamped my authority. I looked around. The people that were behind me originally, they'd all run, and I was just standing there by myself. Yeah. I think I said before about we didn't have social media, and we didn't have the communications that we do today. And that was evident. Like, we'd have to get like the local news and like sent to us, or as in Australian news. And we even did, and it's back to the Kibeho massacre, we did an Anzac Day video where we were just doing a service around a flagpole and all that. We had to pre-tape it before Anzac Day to send home to say, hey, this is what the troops are doing in Rwanda. But reality was Kibeho massacre happened, and we weren't doing that, even though they aired that later on. My family did get to see that. But it would cost us about $50 US on a telecom, not Telstra, card, and you would use like a sat phone or whatever and plug it in and call. So you had to basically pay to call home, and $50 US back in what, 95, 96 was a lot of money, you know, a lot, to be honest. And yeah, you would sort of chew it up. And they had, I remember having on the cards had on a picture on the front of it of a Somalia vet, and he's holding the hand of a little Somali child on the front of it. And they made that for our trip. That sort of shows the ignorance of, you know, they had just Africa and they just had like that sort of picture. In fact, I knew the person who was in the picture, or the silhouette of him. Looking at the end of the trip, it was interesting in itself because we had to clean the vehicles, and we had APCs in country that actually been brought back, and they sit in a museum or something now, the actual APCs, down at Pucka. They didn't have any way, because it's a landlocked country, they had to get them outside the country and then onto a ship somewhere and then so on. So when we were leaving, and we were the last ones really there, it was a handful of us who had to escort these carriers on the back of trucks to be loaded onto other trucks and then moved on to, you know, some other country where they'd be obviously shipped back to Australia. We had to wear actually civilian clothing and follow them and drive these civilian cars back, and then get to the airport. Everyone else was waiting there. Well, it felt like you're, you know, some COVID operation, but it was just so that every time we drove around, the Presidential Guard or something like that, they would harass the Australian or UN troops. So here we were basically driving around with weapons in these like civilian cars, and going from there to the airport to get on the plane to go. Yeah. But I personally, I didn't feel this form of elation or a form of, hey, the mission's only half done. And I say that in retrospect because I did have that feeling when I left Afghanistan, that, hey, the mission's only half done, but I did definitely feel some elation, like, you know, like, oh, I'm out of this place, you know. Rwanda was sort of, as I said, it was just seen, I think, as just sort of this little side mission. You know, it wasn't anything, and people sort of didn't realise some of the actual horrors there. You know, if anything about Rwanda, it was sort of a mentally challenging, not physical. There's operations that have been on like Timor where you're climbing hills, mountains, all that, or Afghanistan where, you know, you're out there and there's actually a real sort of danger from, you know, IEDs and all that. I'm not saying any of them are different. You can die on all these places, but that place was mentally challenging. So I think when it's mentally challenging, people don't appreciate it as much. So in fact, when we got back, we're sort of just given our medals in the away from the cameras. So we got off the plane. And, you know, like at the airport, say you've got the area that just before you go out to where your loved ones meet you and all that. A minister or something turned up. I don't remember who it was, and they just sort of said, here's your medal, here's your medal, here's your medal, and it was sort of, hey, on your way type of thing. I may sound a bit, you know, it's like I'm exaggerating a bit, but that's the way it felt, you know. It wasn't, later on, it's very formal. You know, other medals that I've received from different operations, it's like, and you can see the weight of Australia behind things. And so much so, there's a lot of lessons we learnt from Rwanda, and the people who are still in the military apply, you know, from what they see some of the failures to be a positive now. So they've learnt from that, so that our current troops will never go through that sort of poor process or systemic errors. Me personally, I think it's made me who I am today, definitely. As in appreciate things for what they are, because you see how, some places can be very unlucky, unfortunate, all those negative sort of words, and then you can see how lucky Australia actually is, which does dim my view sometimes when people are sort of whinging about how they've got it bad in Australia or something like that, okay? And I can just sort of, I'll be tight-lipped about it, but I sort of then sort of form the opinion like, hey, you actually don't realise how lucky we are, to see that. And I did have a bit of an outburst to my younger sister when I got back, because she was whinging about something that was just not even, a thing. Because when you've got children walking up to you and they've got a machete stuck in their head and they're asking you for water, you go, whoa, that child has problems, and then you watch other people sort of whinging about they don't have the latest app or something like that, or their Wi-Fi is not working correctly, or the speed, they are not actual real life problems, But that's one aspect of it. I definitely would not never have, if I was asked again, so I'll probably rephrase the question. If I was asked again to go and know what I was about to experience, I would still say yes, I definitely would go. Because I had this logical sense to go, hey, this is Africa at its worst, I get it, but I did get to go to Africa and see it for what it was. Because there was still good moments there, but it's still a lot of bad. Only thing that I do hate about that trip was the effect it had on a lot of my friends. There's a lot of that mental fatigue also, or even further. And unfortunately, there's quite a few people I know who aren't with us today, and some of that may be because of Rwanda. I don't know, but I definitely say at least a few have had the side effect of that. So, and to wrap all this up, and I had mentioned a few times, we went from a level, and I won't just say Rwanda, but Somalia, Cambodia, and also Rwanda. Those 3 trips, people deployed and they sort of got back, and there was no real mechanisms there. It was just a lot of your mates sort of thing and have a beer type thing. But as years went by, you could sort of see, some of it was a facade, and people did have some issues. In particular, people I knew from that deployed to Rwanda, you could see they were a different person. And some of those people that I saw in Alpha Company when I first landed, you could see just a difference. And me personally, I'm the best backyard psychologist there is, but I could almost pick points where some of my friends had actually, their minds had stopped that day. They physically had kept moving in time, but their mind kept reverting back to a certain point in time. So like one of my friends, I remember we were standing on this rubbish at Kibeho. His child had just been born that day in Australia, and one of us actually happened to be standing on a dead baby. We didn't know because it was under the rubbish, and someone goes, "Oh, look at that!" And I was like, "Oh." He at that time I think had changed, and there was a few others, like when you had to go in, you're trying to save children, and you're just basically retrieving bodies, and people firing at you and all that, and you sort of, they will talk about those points, the sights, the sounds, the smell, so that their mind will always revert back to that point. And that's just me, like I said, backyard psychologist, witnessing and experiencing your friends still moving with you in time physically, but their brains just keep going back to that point. They keep reliving it, because where I'll forget the sounds, the smells and all that sort of thing, or you'll need something to jog your memory, they just keep over and over, sort of stuck on that point. As I said, there's a few positives. I saw some people, like was a doctor there. She was a captain or major. She later became a colonel. Carol Vaughan Evans, and she received a medal, and a few others that received great recognition for things that they did over there. And so probably our medal count for that and the actual unit commendation didn't come to like 25 years later, which probably did settle the ship. And it probably and it goes back to that point of where people didn't want to know about it when we first got back. And it's sort of that anguish of, we probably should have got more recognition. And because you then later look at other things that occurred and you think, well, we just lived like that for 6 months. Other units will get something for, like for a one event or one sort of incident, But, I think everything was steadied. I think that unit accommodation, and the people who really did rise above, especially the junior leaders that were there, they did really well, because like some of them had only been out of the Royal Military College for a couple of months, so to speak, and next second they're commanding, infantry troops or medics around under stressful conditions, all by themselves, and I just saw them just rise above it. Yeah.